Some doors aren't locked to keep people out, but to wait for the right one to return. The road to Blackridge Hollow hadn't changed much in 25 years, still a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of pine and quiet land where even the wind seemed to move slower, as if it respected something older than time itself. And Lucas Hale felt it the moment his truck tires left the main highway and rolled onto that forgotten stretch, the soft crunch of gravel beneath him sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. Like he was announcing his return to a place that had never truly let him go. Beside him, Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of ash gray and pale cream, his amber eyes fixed ahead with a focus that wasn't just alertness but something deeper, something that made Lucas tighten his grip on the steering wheel without fully understanding why. The air outside carried that familiar scent of cold pine and damp wood. The kind that clung to your clothes and memories alike, and as the cabin finally came into view at the end of the overgrown trail, Lucas felt something shift quietly inside his chest, not fear, not quite sadness, but a weight he hadn't prepared himself to carry again. The structure stood exactly where he remembered, tucked beneath towering trees, its wooden frame weathered to a faded gray, the front porch sagging slightly under years of snow and silence, and the windows, those narrow, dark windows, looked less like glass and more like eyes that had been closed. For far too long, he parked about 20 yards away, engine idling for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the low hum before turning the key and letting the quiet rush in, and for a second he didn't move, just sat there with his hands resting on the wheel, watching the cabin as if it might disappear if he blinked. Shadow was the first to break the stillness, stepping down from the truck with a soft thud, his paws pressing into the earth as his nose lifted slightly into the air, testing something Lucas couldn't sense. And then he paused, not wandering, not sniffing aimlessly, but standing still with his ears pricked forward and his body angled toward the cabin door. Lucas stepped out slowly, boots sinking just slightly into the soft ground, the cold air brushing against his face as he pulled his jacket tighter around him, and for a moment he almost turned back, almost convinced himself that whatever waited inside that place belonged to the past and should stay there. But Shadow moved forward without hesitation, each step deliberate, as if he already knew where he was going. "Easy, boy," Lucas murmured, though his voice came out quieter than he expected, nearly swallowed by the trees, and he followed, the wooden steps of the porch creaking beneath his weight with a tired, hollow sound that echoed through the silence, a sound that didn't feel empty but watched, like the cabin itself was listening. The front door stood before him, the old iron handle rusted but intact, a heavy lock still fastened across it, its surface marked by years of weather and neglect, and Lucas reached into his pocket, pulling out the key he had received just days ago, a small, cold piece of metal that somehow felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just the right to open a door. He hesitated, just for a second, his eyes drifting toward Shadow, who had stopped a few feet behind him, his posture tense but not afraid, his gaze fixed on the door with an intensity that made Lucas's chest tighten. Then, slowly, Lucas slid the key into the lock, the metal scraping softly as it turned, the sound sharp in the quiet, and when the mechanism finally gave with a dull click, something in the air seemed to shift, subtle but undeniable, like the cabin had taken its first breath in decades. Lucas pushed the door open, the hinges groaning low and long, and a rush of stale, cool air spilled out, carrying the scent of aged wood and forgotten time, and as the darkness inside stretched before him, Shadow let out a low, almost inaudible rumble, not fear, not warning, but recognition, and stepped forward, crossing the threshold before Lucas could say a word, as if whatever had been waiting inside had been waiting for him all along. The moment Shadow crossed into the cabin, the temperature seemed to shift in a way Lucas could not quite explain, not colder, not warmer, but different, like stepping into a space where time had folded in on itself and forgotten how to move forward, and Lucas followed a second later, his boots pressing against the wooden floor with a soft, hollow creak that echoed farther than it should have, as if the room were larger on the inside than it appeared from the porch. Dust hung in the air, drifting lazily through thin beams of light that slipped in through the narrow windows, illuminating pieces of a life left exactly where it had been set down a quarter century ago. A rocking chair near the stone fireplace, a folded quilt draped neatly across it, a small table with a porcelain teacup still resting at its edge, and for a brief moment Lucas felt the strange sensation that if he waited long enough, someone might return to finish the tea. Shadow moved slowly now, no longer charging forward but stepping with measured precision, his nose low to the ground, tracing invisible lines across the worn floorboards as if following a trail that had not faded with time, his ears flicking at sounds Lucas could not hear, subtle shifts in the air that seemed to guide him deeper into the room. Lucas exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, and ran a gloved hand along the wall, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath layers of dust, grounding himself in something physical, something real. Because the silence inside that cabin carried a weight that pressed against his thoughts, not threatening, but insistent, like it wanted to be noticed. He took a few steps forward, his eyes scanning the room, recognizing small details he had nearly forgotten, the carved wooden shelf above the fireplace, the old clock that had long since stopped ticking, frozen at a time Lucas could not remember, and yet everything felt untouched, not abandoned in chaos, but left behind with intention. As though whoever closed that door 25 years ago had expected it to be opened again someday. Shadow paused suddenly near the center of the room, his body going still in a way Lucas had learned never to ignore, not rigid with fear, but focused, alert, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something beneath the surface. And then he let out a low breath through his nose, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, something in between, something that carried recognition rather than alarm. Lucas stepped closer, his boots sounding louder now in the quiet, and crouched slightly, watching the dog's posture, the way his muscles tightened just enough to suggest that whatever he sensed was not random. And for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching thin between them like a held breath. Then Shadow lifted one paw and placed it gently against the floor, pressing down as if testing its strength, his claws scraping lightly across the wood, producing a faint, uneven sound that did not match the rest of the solid boards around them. Lucas frowned, shifting his weight and kneeling beside him, brushing away a layer of dust with his hand, revealing the faint outline of a seam running along the grain of the floor, subtle enough that it could have been missed entirely by anyone who was not looking for it. "You hear something, boy?" Lucas whispered, though he already knew the answer was not something he could hear with his own ears, and Shadow responded not with a bark but with a soft, deliberate tap of his paw, once, then again, the same pattern he had used years ago in places where silence meant more than noise ever could. Lucas's pulse slowed instead of quickening, the calm that had carried him through long nights and uncertain ground settling back into place as he studied the board more closely, running his fingers along the edge until he felt it, a slight give beneath the pressure, not enough to shift on its own, but enough to confirm that it did not belong to the rest of the floor. The air around them felt heavier now, not threatening, but expectant, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for this exact moment, for the right hands, or perhaps the right instinct, to uncover what had been hidden beneath it. Shadow leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on Lucas, his tail low but steady, and there was something in his eyes that Lucas had not seen in a long time, not just alertness, but certainty, a quiet assurance that whatever lay beneath that board was not random, not accidental, but meant to be found. Lucas sat back on his heels, glancing once more around the room, at the stillness, the untouched objects, the silence that no longer felt empty but full of something just out of reach, and then he placed both hands on the edge of the board, his fingers curling around the worn wood, feeling the faint tremor of anticipation that ran deeper than the surface, and for a brief second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for whatever had been kept hidden for so long. Then, with a steady breath, he began to lift. The board resisted at first, not with force but with a quiet reluctance, as if it had settled into place over the years and forgotten how to move, and Lucas adjusted his grip, fingers tightening along the worn edge until it finally gave with a soft, splintering sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness of the cabin, and as the wood lifted, a breath of colder air slipped upward from beneath the floor, carrying with it a scent unlike the dust and age above, something cleaner, deeper, like earth that had not been touched in decades. Shadow leaned forward immediately, his nose hovering just above the opening, drawing in slow, deliberate breaths, his ears angled forward with sharp attention, and then he let out a quiet huff, not alarmed, not unsettled, but certain, the same certainty he had shown before every discovery Lucas had learned to trust without question. The opening beneath the board revealed darkness at first. A narrow space just large enough to suggest that it was not accidental, not damage, but something built, something placed there with intention, and Lucas shifted closer, brushing away loose debris with his hand until the edges of the opening became clearer, squared, reinforced, shaped by careful hands long before he ever thought to return. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on with a soft snap that cut through the quiet. And the beam of light slid into the space below, revealing the top of a wooden ladder, its rungs aged but intact, leading downward into a narrow passage that disappeared into shadow. For a moment, Lucas did not move, his eyes fixed on the opening, his mind trying to place the memory, trying to recall if he had ever known this was here. But nothing came, only the faint echo of childhood summers and distant laughter that felt too far away to trust. Shadow stepped back slightly, then forward again, pacing once in a small circle before stopping at the edge of the opening, his tail steady, his posture alert but not tense. As if he was waiting, not for permission, but for Lucas to understand what he already did. Lucas exhaled slowly, the sound steady and controlled, and angled the flashlight deeper into the passage, the beam catching on the rough wooden walls, the ladder descending perhaps 8 or 10 feet before leveling out into what looked like a small enclosed space beneath the cabin. And there was something about it that did not feel abandoned, not in the way the rest of the cabin had been, but preserved. Protected, as though time had been allowed to pass. Everywhere except there. He leaned closer, lowering himself just enough to test the first rung with his hand, pressing down gently, feeling the solid resistance beneath his palm, and when it held, he shifted his weight carefully, placing one boot on the ladder, then the other, moving with the same measured precision that had once carried him through far less predictable terrain. Shadow watched him closely, his head following each movement. And when Lucas paused halfway down, the dog let out a single, soft sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, something that carried both awareness and reassurance, and Lucas glanced up briefly, meeting those steady amber eyes before continuing the descent. The air grew cooler as he moved downward, the scent of aged wood giving way to something more grounded, more natural, like soil and stone, and when his boots finally touched the floor below, the sound was muted, absorbed by the space rather than echoed, and he straightened slowly, raising the flashlight to take in what lay before him. The room was small but carefully constructed, its walls lined with wooden planks that had been fitted with surprising precision, and along one side stood a narrow table, its surface cleared except for a single metal box resting at its center, the edges worn but the structure intact, and beside it, a chair, simple, sturdy, positioned as if someone had once sat there and simply chosen not to return. Lucas stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the space, revealing more details as it moved, a set of shelves built into the far wall, holding neatly arranged items covered in a thin layer of dust, not scattered, not forgotten, but placed with care, and the longer he looked, the clearer it became that this was not a storage space, not a hiding place for clutter, but something else entirely, something prepared. Above him, shadows shifted at the opening, his silhouette visible against the faint light filtering from the cabin floor, and then, with a controlled movement, the dog began to descend as well, his paws finding each rung with quiet confidence until he reached the bottom and stepped beside Lucas. Immediately turning his attention to the room, his nose lifting, his body still, as if confirming what he had already sensed from above, Lucas lowered the flashlight slightly, the beam now resting on the metal box at the center of the table, and he stood there for a moment, the silence around him no longer empty but filled with a quiet presence, something patient, something that had waited not just years, but for him specifically. And as his hand moved slowly toward the box, he felt it again. That subtle shift in the air, like the space itself was acknowledging that the waiting was finally over. Lucas did not open the metal box right away, his hand resting lightly against its surface as if he could feel something through the cold steel, something that had been sealed inside for longer than he had been gone. And the longer he stood there, the more it became clear that this was not just about what was inside, but about why it had been left here in the first place. The room held its silence with a strange kind of patience, not empty, not forgotten, but watchful, as though every object had been placed with purpose and was now waiting to be understood, and Shadow seemed to sense it too, standing just to Lucas's right, his body still but alert, his gaze shifting slowly from the box to the shelves along the wall and back again, mapping the space in a way that went beyond instinct. Lucas exhaled quietly and finally moved, fingers curling around the small latch at the front of the box, testing it gently before lifting, and the hinge gave without resistance, opening with a soft metallic click that echoed faintly against the wooden walls, revealing the contents inside. There was no gold, no stacks of money, nothing that resembled the kind of treasure people imagined when something was hidden away for decades, only a bundle of carefully folded papers tied with a thin ribbon, a small leather-bound notebook, and beneath them, a set of keys resting against the bottom of the box, their metal dulled with age but still intact. Lucas stared at them for a moment, the simplicity of it almost more surprising than anything else could have been, and he reached in slowly, lifting the notebook. First, the leather worn but preserved, its surface smooth beneath his fingers as if it had been handled often before being placed here. He opened it carefully, the pages inside yellowed with time but neatly written, the ink still clear, and as his eyes moved across the first lines, something shifted inside him, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition. The kind that comes when something you did not know you were missing suddenly finds its way back. The handwriting was familiar, not because he remembered it perfectly, but because something about the shape of it felt like home, like the echo of a voice he had not heard in years but had never truly forgotten. Shadow stepped closer, his head lowering slightly as if to look at the pages, though his attention seemed less on the words and more on Lucas himself, watching the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders eased just slightly as he turned another page. The entries were not random notes or scattered thoughts, but deliberate, written with care and intention, describing days, small details, observations about the land, the cabin, the seasons as they passed, and woven through it all were moments that felt like they had been written for someone else to read, not just recorded, but left behind. Lucas swallowed slowly, his thumb resting against the edge of the page as he paused, letting the weight of it settle, and then he reached back into the box, lifting the bundle of papers tied with the ribbon, the knot simple but secure, and as he untied it, the faint rustle of the pages seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. The first document he unfolded was thicker than the others, more formal, the kind that carried authority in its structure alone, and as his eyes scanned the lines, he felt that same quiet shift again, deeper this time, like something aligning into place. It was a deed, not just for the cabin above, but for the land surrounding it, stretching farther than he had realized, acres of forest and open ground that had remained untouched, preserved under a name he knew all too well, and beneath it, another document. And another, each one building on the last, forming a picture that was larger than he had expected, larger than anything he had come here prepared to find. Shadow let out a soft breath beside him, settling down onto the floor with his front paws stretched forward, his presence steady and grounding, and Lucas glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to the papers, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each page carried a weight that needed to be understood before moving on. When he reached the final sheet, it was different from the rest. Thinner, handwritten, and as he unfolded it, the room seemed to grow quieter still, the air holding still in a way that made even the smallest sound feel significant. Lucas read the first line, and something in his chest tightened, not painfully, but with a kind of quiet gravity that pulled him deeper into the moment, and for a long second he did not move, did not turn the page, did not look away. As if he already understood that whatever came next was not just information, but something meant for him, something that had been waiting all this time for him to return and finally see it. Lucas read the first line again, slower this time, letting each word settle instead of passing through, and the Handwriting, steady but softened by age, seemed to carry more than meaning, it carried intention, as if every letter had been placed not just to inform but to reach him across the years that had stretched between then and now. "If you are reading this, it means you came back." The sentence began, simple and direct, yet it pressed into him with a quiet weight that made the rest of the room fade for a moment, and he found himself lowering the paper slightly, exhaling through his nose as if steadying something inside he had not expected to feel. Shadow shifted closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Lucas's leg, grounding him without needing to demand attention, and Lucas rested his free hand briefly against the dog's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur, drawing comfort from the steady warmth there before returning his focus to the page. The letter continued in that same calm, measured tone, not rushed, not dramatic, but certain, describing how the cabin had never just been a place to live, but a place to prepare, to protect something that could not be left to chance or to the passing hands of strangers. And as Lucas read on, the pieces around him began to align, the hidden room, the preserved supplies, the careful order of everything, none of it accidental, all of it part of something larger that had been built quietly, patiently, over time. The words spoke of seasons spent alone, of listening to the land, of understanding how easily things could be lost when no one was watching, and yet beneath it all was a thread of hope, not the kind that announces itself loudly, but the kind that waits, trusting that the right person will find it when the time comes. Lucas turned the page slowly, the faint sound of paper brushing against paper echoing softly in the enclosed space, and the next section of the letter shifted, becoming more personal, more direct, the sentences shorter, the pauses between them more deliberate, as if the writer had taken time to choose each word carefully. She wrote about him, not in detail, not recounting memories, but acknowledging something she believed he would carry, a sense of distance, of searching, of not quite belonging to any one place after everything he had seen, and Lucas felt his jaw tighten slightly as he read, not in resistance, but in recognition, the kind that comes when someone understands you without needing explanation. Shadow's ears flicked subtly as Lucas shifted his weight, the dog remaining still but attentive, his presence steady like a quiet anchor in the small room, and Lucas continued reading, his voice barely above a whisper though no one else was there to hear it. The letter spoke of the land beyond the cabin, of its boundaries stretching farther than the eye could easily measure, of the trees that had stood longer than most lives, and of something hidden within that land, not buried in the sense of being lost, but kept, preserved with intention, waiting for someone who would know how to see it not as ownership, but as responsibility. Lucas paused again, lowering the paper slightly as his eyes lifted toward the shelves along the wall, as if expecting them to confirm what he was beginning to understand, and for a moment he simply listened, not to any sound, but to the stillness itself, which no longer felt empty but full of quiet meaning. When he looked back down, the final lines of the letter came into view, written with the same steady hand, but carrying a softness that had not been there before, and he read them slowly, allowing each word to settle before moving to the next. "This was never about what you could take from this place, but what you would choose to give back," the line read, and Lucas felt something shift inside him again, not sudden, not overwhelming, but certain, like a door opening somewhere deep within that he had not realized was closed. He folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate, respectful, and placed it back on the table beside the open box, his gaze lingering on it for a moment longer before shifting to the keys still resting inside. Their presence quiet but significant, and as he reached for them, he noticed something else beneath where they had been, a small marking etched into the bottom of the box, faint but intentional, a symbol he did not recognize at first glance but that carried a sense of direction rather than decoration. Shadow stood slowly, his posture changing just enough to signal attention, his head turning slightly toward the far wall where the shelves stood, and Lucas followed his gaze, the connection forming without words, and for the first time since stepping into the cabin, he felt not just curiosity, but purpose, a quiet understanding that what he had uncovered so far was only the beginning, and that whatever had been left for him here extended beyond this room, beyond the box, into something waiting just out of sight, ready to be found. Lucas turned the small set of keys over in his hand, feeling their weight shift against his palm, each one slightly different in shape and wear, as if they belonged to more than a single door, more than a single purpose, and for a moment he simply stood there in the quiet of the hidden room, listening to the stillness that no longer felt empty but alive with something waiting to be understood. Shadow had already moved toward the far wall. His steps slow and deliberate, his nose tracing along the wooden planks that lined the space, pausing at intervals as if checking for something beneath the surface, and when he reached the corner near the built-in shelves he stopped, his body stilling in that familiar way that Lucas had learned to trust without question. The dog did not bark, did not scratch wildly, but instead leaned forward slightly, pressing his nose close to the wood, inhaling slowly as if drawing in a scent that had lingered far longer than it should have, and then he tapped once with his paw, a single, deliberate motion that echoed softly in the enclosed room. Lucas stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the wall, illuminating the shelves stacked with neatly arranged supplies, jars, tools, folded cloths, all placed with care, and for a moment nothing seemed out of place, nothing seemed to stand out as hidden or unusual, yet the longer he looked, the more he began to notice the subtle differences, the way one section of the wall caught the light differently, the grain of the wood running just slightly off from the rest, a detail easy to miss unless you were looking for it. He set the keys down carefully on the table and reached out, running his fingers along the surface of the planks, feeling the faint seams beneath the dust, and there it was, a line so fine it could have been mistaken for natural wear, but too straight, too deliberate to be anything other than a boundary. Shadow shifted his weight, watching Lucas closely, his ears angled forward, his posture calm but attentive, and Lucas pressed gently against the section of wall, testing it the same way he had tested the floor above, not forcing it, not rushing, but listening for the quiet response that would tell him he was right. At first nothing happened, the wood holding firm beneath his hand, but then he noticed something small, almost insignificant, a narrow metal edge tucked just beneath the lip of one of the shelves, hidden in plain sight, and he reached for it slowly, brushing away the thin layer of dust until the shape became clear, a small latch. Worn but intact, he glanced briefly at Shadow, who remained still, his gaze fixed on the movement, and then Lucas pulled the latch gently, the mechanism inside responding with a soft click that echoed faintly through the room, and the section of wall shifted, not swinging open like a door, but sliding inward just enough to reveal a narrow gap. A faint current of air slipped through the opening, carrying with it a scent that was different from the rest of the space, fresher somehow, as if it connected to something beyond the cabin, something that had not been sealed away for decades. Lucas widened the opening carefully, the wood moving with a quiet resistance before giving way, and as the gap expanded, the beam of his flashlight slipped through, revealing a narrow passage carved into the earth beyond the wall, its floor packed firm, its walls reinforced with timber that had aged but not weakened. He stepped closer, angling the light deeper into the passage, and could see that it extended farther than the hidden room itself, leading away from the cabin in a straight line, disappearing into shadow. Shadow moved immediately, stepping through the opening without hesitation, his paws silent against the packed ground as he advanced a few feet into the passage before stopping and turning back, his eyes meeting Lucas's with a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. Lucas took a slow breath, the air in the passage cooler, carrying the faint scent of pine and soil, and he reached back briefly for the keys, slipping them into his pocket before stepping forward, crossing the threshold into the narrow corridor. The space felt different from the room behind him. Less like something preserved and more like something meant to be used, a path, rather than a destination, and as he moved forward, the light from the cabin faded behind him, replaced by the steady beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. Each step was measured, deliberate, the sound of his boots muted against the ground, and Shadow walked just ahead, his body relaxed but alert, guiding the way with an instinct that seemed to know exactly where the path would lead. The passage sloped gently downward for several yards before leveling out, and as Lucas continued, he began to notice something else, a faint shift in the air, a subtle movement that suggested space ahead, something larger than the narrow corridor, and when the beam of his flashlight finally reached the end of the passage, it revealed not a wall, but an opening, a wider chamber beyond, its outline just beginning to take shape in the dim light. Lucas slowed, his steps coming to a near stop as he took in the sight. The sense of anticipation building quietly rather than sharply, and for a moment he simply stood there, the path behind him silent, the space ahead waiting, and Shadow took one more step forward into the threshold of the chamber, pausing just long enough to look back, as if to say that whatever had been hidden here was never meant to stay lost, only to wait until someone was ready to follow it all the way through. The chamber opened slowly into view as Lucas stepped forward, the narrow passage giving way to a space that felt both hidden and intentional, not large in the sense of a cavern, but wide enough to hold more than just objects, wide enough to hold purpose, and the beam of his flashlight moved across the interior with a steady hand, revealing details piece by piece as if the room itself was choosing how to be seen. The walls were reinforced with thick timber beams, aged but strong, set into the earth with careful precision, and the floor beneath his boots shifted from packed soil to something firmer, leveled and smoothed, as though it had been worked on repeatedly over time rather than abandoned. Shadow moved ahead with quiet confidence, his paws making almost no sound as he crossed into the center of the chamber, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the air, and then he stopped, not abruptly, but with a gradual stillness, his body settling into that focused posture Lucas had come to recognize as more than instinct, as understanding. Lucas followed slowly, his eyes adjusting as the flashlight revealed more of the space, and what he saw did not resemble a hidden stash or forgotten storage, but something far more deliberate. Something built with intention and maintained with care. Along one side of the chamber stood a long wooden workbench, its surface worn smooth from use rather than time, and on it rested a series of neatly arranged tools, each one placed in a specific position, not scattered or neglected, but ordered, as if they had been set down recently despite the years that had passed. Above the bench, a set of shelves held rows of glass jars, each labeled in careful handwriting, their contents preserved in a way that suggested knowledge rather than urgency, preparation rather than panic. Lucas stepped closer, the beam of light catching the faint lettering on one of the jars, and though he could not read it clearly from where he stood, the presence of it alone told him that this space had not been built in haste, but with patience, with thought, with a plan that extended beyond a single moment. Shadow shifted slightly to the left, his attention drawn toward the far side of the chamber, where the wall curved gently inward, and Lucas followed his gaze, moving the light across the surface until it revealed something different, something that did not match the rest of the room. Set into the far wall was a structure that looked less like part of the chamber, and more like something placed within it, a large wooden frame reinforced with metal brackets, and at its center, a door, solid and unadorned, its surface smooth but marked by time, not worn down, but worn in, as though it had been used exactly as much as it needed to be and no more. Lucas slowed as he approached, his steps measured, the quiet around him deepening in a way that felt almost responsive, and he noticed that the air near the door felt slightly different, not colder, not warmer, but carrying a faint current that moved just enough to be felt rather than heard. Shadow stood a few feet away from the door, his posture steady, his ears angled forward, and for the first time since entering the chamber, he let out a soft, low sound, not a warning, not a sign of unease, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if he recognized the importance of what stood before them. Lucas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the set of keys he had taken from the metal box, and he paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the door. His mind quiet but focused, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that did not feel forced but natural, as though this path had always been leading here. He pulled the keys out slowly, holding them up in the beam of the flashlight, and one by one, he examined them, the shapes, the cuts, the subtle differences that now seemed less random and more purposeful, and when his eyes returned to the door, he saw it. A small keyhole set just beneath the metal latch, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Shadow stepped closer, stopping just at Lucas's side, his presence steady and calm, and Lucas felt a quiet certainty settle over him, not excitement, not urgency, but something deeper, something that felt like understanding. He selected one of the keys, the one that seemed to match not just in size but in weight, and as he moved it toward the lock, his hand remained steady, his breath even. The silence around him holding still as if waiting, the metal slid into place with a soft, precise fit, and for a brief second nothing happened, the moment stretching just enough to be felt, and then Lucas turned the key, slowly, deliberately, and the mechanism inside responded with a quiet click that echoed through the chamber like a signal finally answered, and as his hand remained on the handle, he understood without needing to be told that whatever lay beyond that door was not just another discovery, but the reason all of this had been built, the reason it had been kept hidden, and the reason he had been led here, step by step, until there was nowhere else to go but forward. Lucas did not push the door open immediately, his hand resting against the handle as the quiet of the chamber seemed to gather around that single point. The key still turned in the lock as if the act itself had already changed something deeper than the mechanism inside the wood, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Shadow stood just behind him, close enough that Lucas could feel the steady warmth of his presence, the dog's breathing slow and even, his posture calm but attentive, and when Lucas finally moved, it was not with hesitation, but with a quiet acceptance, as if he understood that whatever lay beyond the door was not meant to be avoided or delayed. The door opened with a low, smooth motion, not resisting, not creaking, but giving way as though it had been waiting to be opened again. And as the beam of the flashlight slipped into the space beyond, it revealed the room. Unlike any they had seen so far, not hidden in the sense of being buried or concealed, but preserved in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost intentional beyond simple storage or survival. The air inside was different, not stale like the cabin above, not cool and earthy like the passage behind them, but still, balanced, as though the space had been sealed in a way that allowed it to remain untouched by time. Lucas stepped inside slowly, the light sweeping across the room, and what it revealed caused him to pause, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was unexpectedly simple in a way that carried more weight than anything extravagant could have. The room was arranged like a living space, not temporary, not improvised, but complete, with a narrow bed along one wall, neatly made with a folded blanket at its foot, a small wooden desk positioned beneath a built-in lamp that had long since gone dark, and shelves that held books, journals, and small personal items placed with care. Shadow moved in quietly behind him, his paws soft against the floor, his nose lifting as he took in the air, and then he walked forward, circling once before stopping near the desk. His attention fixed there with a quiet certainty that drew Lucas's focus as well. Lucas approached slowly, the beam of his flashlight settling over the surface of the desk, and there, resting at its center, was another notebook, larger than the one he had found before, its cover worn but intact, and beside it, a single envelope, sealed and addressed in the same steady handwriting he now recognized without question. Lucas felt his breath slow as he reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing lightly over the surface before lifting it. The paper firm despite its age, and for a moment he simply held it, feeling the weight of something that had been left not just to be found, but to be understood. Shadow sat beside the desk, his posture calm, his gaze shifting briefly to Lucas before returning to the envelope, as if acknowledging its importance without needing to react to it. Lucas broke the seal carefully, the faint sound of the paper opening echoing softly in the still room, and as he unfolded the letter inside, he noticed something immediately. The handwriting was the same, but the tone felt different, not distant, not observational, but direct, intentional in a way that reached toward him rather than simply recording what had been. He began to read, his voice low, steady, the words filling the space in a way that made the silence feel less like absence and more like presence. The letter spoke not of what had been hidden, but of why it had been hidden, not of protection from others, but of preservation for the right moment, the right person, and as Lucas continued, the meaning became clearer. This place had never been meant to be discovered by chance. It had been built, prepared, and left behind with the belief that one day, someone would return not just to claim it, but to continue what had been started. The words described the land beyond the chamber, the trees, the water, the soil, not as property, but as something living, something that required care, attention, understanding, and the more Lucas read, the more he realized that what had been left for him was not simply a hidden space or a set of documents, but a responsibility, a continuation of something that had been quietly sustained for years. He lowered the letter slightly, his eyes moving across the room once more, taking in the bed, the desk, the shelves, the quiet order of everything, and it no longer felt like a place that had been abandoned, but like a place that had been waiting, not for anyone, but for him. Shadow shifted closer, resting his head briefly against Lucas's leg, a simple gesture that carried a quiet reassurance, and Lucas placed a hand gently against the dog's neck. His gaze returning to the letter as the final lines came into view. They were simple, written with the same steady hand, but carrying a weight that settled deep rather than sharply, a quiet truth rather than a dramatic revelation, and as he read them, Lucas understood something he had not expected when he first stepped onto the porch of the cabin, that this was never about uncovering a secret, but about finding a place where something unfinished could begin again, and as the silence settled around him once more, it no longer felt like something to be filled, but something to be kept. Morning arrived slowly over Blackridge Hollow, not with sudden light but with a gradual softening of the darkness, as if the land itself was waking in its own time, and Lucas stood just outside the cabin, the cool air brushing against his face as he watched the first pale gold rays slip through the tall pines, stretching across the ground in long, quiet lines. The cabin behind him no longer felt like a place sealed in the past, but something different now, something open, something that had shifted simply because he had stepped inside and chosen to stay. Shadow moved a few feet ahead, his nose low to the ground as he traced the edges of the clearing, his movements calm and steady, no longer searching in the way he had been before, but observing, as if the urgency had passed and what remained was something quieter, something settled. Lucas took a slow breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs, and for the first time in a long while, the air did not feel heavy, did not press against his chest with memories he could not quite outrun, but instead carried a stillness that felt possible. He turned slightly, his gaze moving from the tree line to the cabin, then beyond it, toward the stretch of land he now understood in a way he had not the day before, not just as property or inheritance, but as something living, something that had been cared for in silence and now stood waiting, not for ownership, but for attention. The letter remained folded in his pocket, its words no longer something he needed to read again, but something he carried, not as instruction, but as understanding, and as he stood there, he realized that nothing he had found beneath the cabin had asked him to become someone else, had not demanded that he fix or rebuild what had been lost, but simply offered him a place where he could begin again without needing to explain why. Shadow returned to his side, his tail moving slowly, not in excitement, but in quiet contentment, and Lucas rested a hand briefly against the dog's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the grounding presence that had carried him through more than he could count. Together they walked toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees opened just enough to reveal a narrow path leading deeper into the forest, one that Lucas had not noticed before, or perhaps had simply not been ready to see. The path was not marked, not carved with intention like the passage beneath the cabin, but worn gently into the earth, shaped by time and quiet movement, and as Lucas paused at its beginning, he felt that same subtle pull he had felt when he first stepped onto the porch. Not a demand, not a force, but an invitation. Shadow stepped forward. First, just a few feet, then stopped and looked back, his eyes steady, his posture calm, and Lucas gave a faint nod, more to himself than to the dog, before following. The forest welcomed them without sound, the tall pines standing still as the morning light filtered through their branches, casting shifting patterns across the ground, and with each step, the world behind him seemed to grow quieter, not fading, but settling into place, as if it no longer needed to be carried forward in the same way. They walked for what felt like a long time, though Lucas did not check the distance, did not measure the path in miles or minutes, because for once, there was no need to reach an end, no need to calculate what came next, only the quiet rhythm of movement, and the steady presence of something that felt right in a way he had almost forgotten. Eventually, the trees opened again, revealing a small rise in the land, and beyond it, a stretch of open ground that caught the sunlight fully, the grass there lighter, softer, as if it had been protected from the heavier shadows of the forest, and Lucas stopped, taking in the view. The way the land seemed to breathe in its own slow rhythm. Shadow moved ahead, then circled back, his tail lifting slightly as he settled near the center of the clearing, and Lucas followed, stepping into the light, feeling its warmth against his face, his shoulders, the simple, grounding sensation of being present in a place that asked nothing more from him than to remain. He stood there for a long moment, the silence around him no longer something to fill or escape, but something to keep. Something that held space for what could come next without rushing it, without defining it too soon. And as the sun rose higher, casting longer light across the land that now belonged to him in a way that felt deeper than ownership, Lucas understood something he had not known when he first turned that key, that not every inheritance is meant to be spent or sold, and not every secret is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be lived, quietly, patiently, one step at a time. Until the place that once felt forgotten becomes the place you finally choose to stay.